There were archetypal energies erupting in the 60s, and no one quite knew what they were. In Martin Scorsese's documentary, No Direction Home, there's footage of Bob Dylan sitting at the kitchen table writing a song and then turning to Joan Baez, who was with him, and saying something like, "Do you know where this stuff comes from? Because I've got no idea." And I remember, being a young boy at primary school, and a new teacher came to our school. His name was Rick McKellar, and um, I'd never met anyone like him before. He was in the small and the conservative, country town where I lived. He was kind of progressive, well-read, intellectual. He was like half intellectual, half hippie, and uh, he started playing. Our English lessons became, he'd bring in albums from the 60s, and um, what would happen is we'd listen to them and then we'd have a conversation about them. He was probably the only progressive person in that whole country town. I'm not exactly sure. But we'd listen to them. There's something in the air by Thunderclap Newman, or there's something happening around here by Buffalo Springfield. Um, Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles. It's kind of like um, there was something that was blowing, some archetypal energies that were blowing people's minds, but they didn't know exactly what it was. And I basically, think that there's two ways to look at the 60s now. The first is through the puer, the eternal youth. It's like the puer, adventurous free spirit entered into Jack Kerouac when he went on the road and then started crisscrossing the US. And when he said, "There's nothing behind us and everything before us, as is ever so on the road." It was like there was this wandering idealism and creativity erupting in the youth, the youthful spirit, the adventurous youthful spirit. And self-exploration and discovery were becoming just as important as the straight upward path to success. And then another way I would see the 60s is through the Dionysian energy. It's like the Dionysian energy was erupting through Jim Morrison, who was making girls and women shriek. He had wild and unruly curly hair that made him look like Dionysus. Jim Morrison looked like Dionysus, as I would imagine Dionysus would look like. And he had broken through to the other side, and he was now helping loosen things up from the impossibly straight 1950s, which wasn't before time because the 1950s was unnaturally repressed and somehow like an endlessly recurring replay of My Three Sons. And Jim Morrison was just trying to rectify things with some looser Dionysian poetry. And some of the archetypal energies might not have been that well understood, but they were exciting. Like some of those women or girls in impossibly tight miniskirts. What was happening there? That was exciting. It was like Aphrodite Venus had entered into the world through the legs. And Venus has her own kind of light, her own kind of peculiar light, which is not exactly like the light of the sun, but just as dazzling in its own way, if not more so. It was confusing to men, but they did understand they needed beauty to live. So Aphrodite Venus was also erupting in the 60s. And then this somehow morphed into the new age of the 1970s and the 80s, where people headed off to the east and started following an Indian guru, and then came out of their closet with some of their spiritual beliefs, which included the holy word Om as the original sound of the universe. George Harrison might have started the new age. It's kind of like the archetypal energies erupted in the 60s, and then in the 70s and 80s, there was this eruption of new spirituality. It had morphed into this um, where people were heading into other cultures to to experience spirituality. And some of my friends started burning enough incense to kill a horse, which they saw as a spiritual practice. Maybe there was a little bit of mimicking of the East in the New Age. Everyone started talking about reincarnation and karma. It was at this time I started saying I had a previous birth as Shirley MacLaine, which I thought was funny, but which some of my friends, God bless them, immediately accepted as a possibility and probably true. This just started to worry me. But even though the New Age was incredibly suspect and could sometimes be like a trip, and you met quite a few people who actually thought they were enlightened, it was still like things were opening up in the world. It was like there was a new spirituality that was entering into the world. I had a friend called Athena Starwoman who did the astrology for the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, and she drove around in a big black Bentley and had a lovely property overlooking Whale Beach. And we did a program there with Daddy Janky from India called Meditation for Busy People. And there were corporate people and advertising executives and people from the film and television industry. Albie Felsen, who made surfing documentaries, had just stayed in one of those houseboat boats on a lake in the Kashmir. There were people doing all this new age stuff, and there was a new spirituality erupting in the world. But it was like there was just the nascent beginnings of a new spirituality. Maybe that's what made it suspect. And even though people didn't quite know what it was that they were trying to bring to, they, even though people didn't know quite maybe what the new spirituality was, they were trying to bring it into a form in their life. They were experimenting. They were exploring with the new spirituality. Then things seemed to morph into something more psychological. There were many popular authors who were starting to draw on psychology, and quite a few of them were drawing on Jungian depth psychology, um, drawing on that tradition of depth psychology. And Robert Bly had been very influenced by Marie-Louise von Franz, who was a colleague that many people will know was a colleague of Jung's. And he came out with Iron John. I remember reading Iron John. He said something like, the New Age people are very nice. We like them very much. They're sensitive. They have good manners and they have spiritual leanings. But might not have stolen the key from under their mother's pillow yet. I think, when there was this burst of New Age activity, which was somehow seemed suspect, but there was also new things entering. But then when things morphed into psychology or into something more psychological, there was kind of like this deepening going on. And I know for me, I maybe realized something about the idealism and the optimism, over optimism, the over idealism, the kind of transcendentalism of the spirituality that was around. And I think, this story he had about uh, stealing the key from under the mother's pillow was like, moving on from childhood and youth. And basically, it was about, someone getting their feet on the ground. And if you read Robert Bly for long enough, you started associating the New Age with the pure flying boys or girls. Maybe they had a mother complex. And then Robert Johnson came out with Owning Your Own Shadow. And then well, it definitely made me think that maybe spiritual people, maybe in that new age spirituality that I was experiencing, that people didn't always specialize in owning their own shadow. They might have been blinded by the light whilst flying towards the sun. They were imagining figures of light and enlightenment and not anything dark, which was seen as very, very bad, but also unenlightened. And Robert Johnson was just trying to say that the shadow isn't all bad and that there can be gold in the shadow. And then I read the essay Peaks and Vales by James Hillman. It was about that time I came across James Hillman. And it was at that moment for me that well, maybe firstly, it was one of the most important things I'd ever read. And then it was kind of an aha moment for me because it made this distinction between the spirit that loves the heights and the soul that loves the depths. And I think, even though we say things about psychology sometimes, in terms of the diagnose, how we've had 100 years of psychology and things are just getting worse in the sense of the diagnosis of psychology, um, some of the negative side of psychology. But it seems to me that when things morphed into the psychological stage, there was kind of a deepening going on. And I know Hillman's essay, Peaks and Vales, it made me think of how depth brings perhaps more of a substance to our own spirituality and uh, more of a depth and more of a substance to our own spirituality, and something which is even more associated with the particulars and the vernacular of our own life. And I think that's something that also Thomas More started to take up, that the everyday sacred, the everyday um, spirituality. And I think that, whilst in a way the 60s so much was erupting, and then in the new age there was so much that was also coming into the world, that in a way psychology has had a really good psychology has grounded all of this a little bit more. It's given us the myths, the stories, um, some of the archetypal perspectives, which can help us, uh, discriminate between things more. And it's helped us fill out the spirituality so much more.